Hello, my name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest, Hungary. We are holding a Danube Dialogue here today to interview James C. Bennett, and I will be talking a lot about James later, who is a visiting speaker here at a conference which we are holding on After Ukraine, Will Europe and the Anglosphere stay together? But we'll come back to that. James C. Bennett, I'm going to be raising a lot of points about your life and career, but rather than just read a list now, I'll do so, mention these things in the course of a conversation. The other member of the conversation is my colleague, Eric Hendriks, who is a distinguished fellow at the Danube Institute and whose responsibilities include, of course, China watching and China history. So welcome to this discussion. The first point I'm going to make, Jim, is you are known as the father of the Anglosphere. And I would like you, if you would, to describe to me how you got that title, and in particular, the kind of interesting and curious story that you set out to write one book and ended up writing another. Would you like to get into that?
Yes, thank you. Well, I've always been interested in questions of history, society, culture, etc. I did anthropology as my major at the University of Michigan. A lot of people on the libertarian and conservative worlds have a background in economics. I think that kind of narrows their focus too much, and it's always been interesting to come in with a anthropology, linguistics, cultural background for dealing with this. In the immediate post-Cold War era, the 1991 type thing, of course, there was a great wave of enthusiasm about, I think, what's now called neoliberalism, global freedom, market economy, structural reform, and all this, and how that was going to rapidly lift the third world out of its morass of poverty, etc., and unleash a wave of entrepreneurial creativity. And as a result of that, I had been working in the commercial space launch industry for about a decade. And I was kind of burnt out on some of the stresses of entrepreneurism, so I decided to try going in a different direction. I started to wonder about what the advent of the internet and virtual transactions, what became e-commerce, were going to affect world and society. Started giving some talks on my thoughts on that. I was picked up by a group of investors who believed very much in the neoliberal vision and international commerce and development, and wanted to put a little group together to look for investment opportunities in the rapidly developing, emerging economies. So I started working with them and did a number of projects in Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, other parts of the emerging world, but primarily that, and immersed myself in what was happening, particularly in Argentina and Brazil. And I saw governments that were doing all the right things according to the handbook. And, then, of course, Argentina particularly crashed at the end of that decade, 98, 99. So we went into 2000. And all the people that had been very enthusiastic down there were beginning to just get upset. You had the situation, Carlos Menem was a big reformer. He got rid of a lot of the Peronist boondoggles, which meant that thousands and tens of thousands of workers were thrown out on the street. Most of them actually weren't working there. They were party hacks who were drawing salaries but not actually working. But that's another story. and the entrepreneurial sector couldn't overcome the corruption and familism barriers to get somewhere. And one of my directors in the project he invested in 2 resort condo projects, one in New Zealand and one in Argentina. Absolutely beautiful areas in both countries. The one in New Zealand was developed in about 2 to 3 years, went on the market, and was a huge economic success. The one in Argentina, which had an even more beautiful position and on a lake with the Andes right there, was like stunning. As soon as they began putting money into it, other people came in and disputed the title to the land. They took it to court. The judge who was at the court was the cousin of the person who was claiming it. And conflict of interest didn't seem to be an issue there. And the more I thought about, that was only one example of many things I saw. It's like macroeconomic reforms by themselves don't matter. What the real trumps are cultural, linguistic patterns of behavior. And some countries work together a lot better than others. And often the only way to try to bridge that gap is by top-down state fiat, which has all of its own problems. I mean, although some of the assumptions of neoliberalism were incorrect, but some of the basic observations were quite correct as far as the limits and problems of top-down state force.
Let me just intervene here. So the kind of cultural values that promote success are widespread social trust.
Yes.
Respect for law.
Yes.
Good basic education. Strong family structures in one sense, but not in another.
Yes.
The willingness to trust people outside the family as well as within. And finally, I suppose, low tolerance for crime and including corruption.
A tolerable administration of justice was, I think, what Adam Smith said, and that what were the 3 things? But anyway, sound currency, a tolerable administration of justice, and general education, I think, were the main things. And yes, I basically saw that in practice.
I think the World Bank did a report, would be about 25 years ago now, to look into the success of the East Asian, the Asian tigers, as we then call them. And I think they found something very similar to that. Now, that does explain, I think, and just if you could just discuss this briefly, the different outcomes for Australia and Argentina when, if you look at both those countries in 1900, they were both extremely prosperous. They were both were reliant on newcomers coming in, like large amounts of immigration, and yet one is now by any standards a successful country, and the other has had its moments, but they've been very unstable moments.
Yes. I wrote a column for you once, or UPI, called The 4 Lucky Countries and How They Fared, and looked at Argentina and Uruguay versus Australia and New Zealand. And all 4 had very similar colonial economies, basically raising sheep and cows and selling their products back to the first world, and mostly to Britain.
Yes, but I must intervene again here because we've got to, in a sense, a lot of ground to cover. Yes. So you set out to write a book, and the book was one that would celebrate this neoliberal set of theories and concepts. But in the middle of writing it, you found out you thought it was wrong, and then you switched.
Well, I found out it was incomplete.
Yes.
I was talking about how going to e-commerce would totally lower a lot of the transactional barriers around the world. It was the basic theory of globalism. And then I thought, and then I started to say, but once the physical barriers of distance and the artificial political structures like tariffs were eliminated, there were still these cultural differences, linguistic differences, which imposed quite substantial transaction costs. And if you look at national borders as a transaction cost lowering method for the internal area, you see that if you wanted to join countries together, to link them together, the lower the inherent barrier of the cultural differences and linguistic differences were, the more successful, the more deeply they could cooperate. I eventually found out there are actually studies on this, and they put the number at about 15% advantage for having same language between two trading countries.
Well, it would be interesting to find out what those studies are exactly.
It's somewhere in the references back in my book.
Okay.
But, and then I said, well, if this is the case, if mountains and rivers and oceans don't create and join countries, then languages will. And what we're going to see emerge in the post-Cold War world were groupings of countries with similar cultural, linguistic traits. And then when I tried to come up with examples, the only one that really fit that pattern well was English-speaking countries. Because, unfortunately, Spanish-speaking countries are notoriously poor at cooperating with each other. Although, as a cultural entity, they are unifying quite rapidly. In other words, Mexican television is the standard everywhere in the Spanish-speaking world because they have cost advantages, but it's native speakers.
May I just say that I'm very enthusiastic about your culturalistic turn, so to speak. And John introduced me as a China watcher, but I'm also a sociologist. And I feel it's been lacking in my discipline, this focus on cultures. It was there originally in the beginning of the 20th century when sociology was being founded as a discipline. But gradually in the 20th century, cultural perspectives were marginalized in the discipline, and people had to focus on formal institutions, formal arrangements, and it became a bit taboo even to talk about cultures, because as soon as you start talking about cultures, you start talking about national cultures, and there's a great institutionalized fear and hostility towards nationalism in the contemporary humanities. It wasn't there in the original humanities in the 19th century, but it slipped in the 20th century at some point. But so it's the, I mean, your case, so to speak, shows the shortcoming in contemporary social science, because you're an accomplished businessman, and then you have to kind of fill the gap by explaining how important these cultural zones are, whereas we have tens of thousands of social scientists working at university. It was their job to tell us this, right? But let me just give you a study that was recently published. It's called On Nationology, and it was a kind of heterodox study by two social scientists, and they looked at the World Value Survey. It's a big survey that's taken around the world, and they looked at what the strength of the different explanatory variables, or in explaining the different cultures, and they find that, quote, contrary to many scholars' intuitions, alternative social aggregates such as ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups, as well as diverse social demographic categories, add negligible explained variance to that already captured by nations. They find out that a person's nationality is the variable that gives you by far the most insight. It explains most of the variance, right? And then other studies, for instance, by Engelhardt and Wenzel, they're famous for their world culture map, where they look at this rough overlapping data sets, also World Value Survey and other data sets, and they show that the different national groups actually cluster together into world regions. So actually, if you look at the empirical data coming from social science, there are strong indications that the world is grouped into what you could call civilizational or world regional zones, and then within those, the nations add the most variance. So we are kind of blocks within blocks to a large extent. But this is exactly what the rest of the discipline is not trying to focus on, because we have to focus on individuals, subcultures, formal institutions, but please, not nations and civilizations.
Right. And the Engelhardt World Values Chart is one of the pieces of evidence that I found when I went looking for academic agreement or disagreement with the thesis. You see all the Anglosphere countries are clustered in one clump that you can easily draw a line around. So, yes, well, even anthropology no longer is allowed to talk about culture.
It's their central concept, and they disavowed it. But
yes, and you're an
sometimes okay.
and you began as an anthropologist, I think.
Yes, well, there's this odd thing in academia where basically anthropologists and sociologists are like, the two different unions in the movie industry where, you come up and say, you can't move that chair, that's a stagehand's job. And, it's just as bad. It's really one social science with these competing, and then there's like international relations, which is a total boondoggle. But because I've been to IR conferences, they did one on the Anglosphere as a concept in Toronto in 2011. And they invited me, but I felt like the chimpanzee at the primatologist conference because I was the only one there that believed in the Anglosphere.
Yeah.
But
the whole contemporary body of knowledge is organized in such a way as to not make people see the importance of these world regions.
Right.
Now, I have to hurry this conversation along because so you, in fact, turn the first book on the neoliberal revolution into the Anglosphere challenge. And,
yes.
And that book came out, 2000?
It was actually published in 2004. It was essentially ready for the publisher in September 2001. And, I was literally about to hand in the final manuscript. And then, of course, the September 11th events happened. I thought, I'd better put this in the drawer for a year and see how this all falls out because it might totally invalidate everything. But, and on the other hand, it didn't. The working title of the manuscript was called The Network Commonwealth. And it was it was the publisher's suggestion. He said, you talk about these network commonwealths, but the only one you're really talking about is the Anglosphere, so why don't you use Anglosphere in the title? So we came up, and my point was that it's a challenge both the Anglosphere's position in the world of power and influence is a challenge to other nations and civilizations, but it's also a challenge to ourselves because we also have inherent flaws in Anglosphere culture which bubble to the surface from time to time. And, the better angels of our nature have to overcome those on a regular basis. I think the woke phenomenon is an example of that happening right now.
Can I ask you first to give us a quick explanation of what a network commonwealth is, quite brisk, and then why it was that the Anglosphere argument proved to be, at one level, highly controversial, on the other level, increasingly accepted as a description of reality?
Yes. The network commonwealth was my discussion of what's going to emerge in the wake of the digital revolution and globalization of information. And it was that people of like linguistic cultural backgrounds will create a large number of connecting threads between the nations, not as a single big chunk, the way the European Union tries to do with its legal corpus and its treaties, but just many, many strands of different connections that, sometimes they connect all of the countries, sometimes they connect different pairs of it, but it's quite a strong web of connections, both businesses, personal relationships, intermarriage, and government structures. And quite often the government structures aren't at the very top level. They are, from my own experience, I was part of a U.S. government committee on developing regulations for commercial space travel. And some years later, I was invited to be on a British committee for that. And it began with some bureaucrats from the UK Space Agency wanting to create a pan-European, this is back in 2012, 2013, a pan-European regulatory system. Interestingly enough, the head of the Swedish Space Agency was vehemently against that. And then I said, you should really look more at the FAA and the American system on space regulation. I think it suits British law and British custom much more. And eventually they flew over to the States, had a visit with the U.S. FAA office on these things, and came back and created a system that was like 90% the same. And there is an ongoing strong communication between FAA and the British CAA, more than any other regulatory agency, even more than Transport Canada. And this is repeated all through the government on many, many different levels. And then there are formal organizations like the Five Eyes Intelligence Group, and all the NORAD subcommittees, this kind of thing. And it's interesting that I remember I did a study on history of NORAD for George Washington University Space Policy Institute, where I'm also an adjunct researcher. And I interviewed a bunch of U.S. and Canadian officers, Air Force officers, about the NORAD experience. And they said, basically, the air forces of both countries trust each other, then we trust them more than we trust the other armed services in our own country. And
let me raise this point that you were saying, Eric, that as someone from Holland, that you're on the edge of the Anglosphere, and you have
for the viewers at home, that I said that during just off the camera. Yeah.
And that particular is an interesting position to be in, and you've become convinced that the Anglosphere is something real, and not, as a lot of people in politics, particularly on the left, would want to say it's a product of either nostalgia or racism.
Yes, exactly. I mean, my European friends and I, continental European friends and I, my Scandinavian friends, we commonly use the term Anglosphere. So I have to thank Mr. Bennett for popularizing that. I didn't know you did that until fairly recently. So yeah, thank you for the term, because the term is important. If you're in the Netherlands, you have you can get a very clear sense of the substantive reality of the Anglosphere, because the Netherlands is on the border between the Anglosphere culture zone and the Northern European or post-Protestant European culture zone. It's a little bit politically incorrect, but perhaps perhaps this can be cut or something. But you could call it Germanic Europe. Yeah. But of course, because of historical events, that term has become extremely tainted. But this is what if as a Dutch person, if I go to Scandinavia on little trips to Norway or Sweden, or if I'm in Germany, I constantly recognize things that are also in my own culture. And then if I go to the Anglosphere, I have the same experience. And I talked to Melvin Schut. He's a friend of ours. He's a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam. And Melvin said once, he said to me, actually, it's quite simple. The Netherlands is culturally just in between Britain and Germany. It's just where you put it geographically. And if you're on the border, then you get a real sense of the realness of these cultures. Perhaps if you're in it, then you can be overwhelmed by the diversity that exists within a culture zone. But that's the case with all culture zones. You don't really see them unless you're on the edge or outside of them.
Yes. That I think is true. And I want to, I should say that, Jim, you never claimed to invent the phrase. That's Neil Stephenson. But your book did effectively mean the concept was popularized and became a topic of discussion.
Well, I fleshed it out and defined it.
Yes.
He threw it out. This is his style. It's kind of like the kung fu artist of writers. He just flings out neologisms and concepts and stuff and never explains them in his books, and it was like a drive-by, almost like a drive-by shooting. He mentioned it once. It was obvious from the context what he meant by it, and he never used it again. And later on, I was a fan of his anyway, but I was thinking, Well, that's a term. Everyone knows what it means without it ever having been defined. And so I'm going to define it. And I fleshed it out and developed a whole ideology about it. But thanks, Neil.
Do you think it played a part in, or simply in a sense explained in advance, the Brexit result?
I think my particular contribution or blame, depending on your point of view, in the Brexit phenomenon is that I helped launch the wave of sentiment on the U.S. right that the European Union, including the UK, was not in America's interest, and America's interest would be better served by Brexit, and that also we had a better offer to give the Brits than Europe did. And if you remember, a lot of people on the American right up to 2000 were people who saw the EU primarily as a free trade phenomenon and part of globalism, part of neoliberalism, and were in favor of it. And there was some strategic types who thought, well, the EU helps bind Europe to the United States for strategic purposes. And Kissinger wanted the one person he could call up to represent Europe. The problem was that whenever they tried to nominate such a person, if an American ever called that person, half of the EU would call up to say, we disagree with that.
Now, I should also ask you to clarify something else. I mentioned the left tends to dismiss this as a nostalgic come racist idea. Of course, it is the case that all of these countries, the core members of the Anglosphere, the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they are all multi-ethnic societies. They're no longer mono-ethnic in any way. And secondly, if we think of those as the core, I think I would suggest there is a wider Anglosphere, which would include, I'll take 3 countries at random, possibly India, Singapore, and the West Indies.
Oof.
Over to you first.
Really, that's
you
ambitious.
Come back. Go on. Yeah.
I think of it as around the core Anglosphere is a hybrid zone where the people aren't exactly members of the Anglosphere in the same way that Brits and Americans are, for instance, yet their cultures have been permanently changed by their time under Anglosphere colonial rule, and they have created essentially hybrid societies that have quite a few Anglosphere traits in common, that they use the language as their language of wider communication. You have this interesting thing where in like India and the Philippines, there have been attempts to create a synthetic national language and have that replace English as the language of administration and the first language. And typically it was built around one core local language that was not a majority or not a overwhelming majority language, Hindi, which is itself a synthetic language, and Filipino is actually Tagalog. But what you find is that all the other minority languages vehemently hate that and have a strong political demand to retain English. So, Peggy Mohan is a linguist and anthropologist who's written a lot about use of English in India and how it went from being a class marker for the small English-educated upper class, who are all Hindi nationalists, and the new English speakers who learn it in street schools so they can get jobs in call centers. And it's the latter people who absolutely hate the idea of replacing English as the language of administration. I showed this to a Filipino friend of mine. He said, that's exactly the same way it's happening in the Philippines. So this hybrid zone is itself really, really interesting as a cultural phenomenon. And of course, each nation has its own version of that hybrid culture. And I think 1,000 years from now, its traces will be evident. I don't know what this is going to mean for the world, politics, or culture, but it'll be there.
Your response?
Well, the traces of British colonial influence are visible in many places around the world, and they are lasting legacies that could function as bridges back to the Anglosphere. At the same time, entities such as India have an enormous cultural gravity on their own. They have such a complex social and cultural fabric that that even if there is a bridge there that reaches into the Anglosphere, I would say that countries with less cultural gravity, like the Netherlands, because of its size and because of its more longer, probably even more deeply intertwined character with Britain, are probably more hybrid. I mean, I would argue that the Netherlands is more in the Anglosphere than India is, even if English is used in more formal settings in India. But I'm not even sure if that's the case, because even at nowadays at the Dutch university, it's impossible to write a PhD in Dutch, right? It's all in English. So.
Yeah, I see. Well, I was going to say that you can see a difference between Pakistan and India. They both have obviously strong Anglosphere ties, particularly migration and diaspora communities. But the imposition of Islam, I mean, it's 99% of the society, and it's encouraged strongly by government. Effectively weakens, I think, the Anglosphere nature,
or strengthens it if you think that if you given the fact that Britain itself is and to some extent Canada and Australia are themselves becoming extremely Muslim.
Well, I think I think I could see that point, and I think that if you also look, however, at the status of Indian and Sikh. So Hindu and Sikh communities in England, and I would stick to England here, then they clearly are, in a sense, more integrated in the society and less, and because of that, they present less of a problem for the society than does Muslim immigration. But does anyone want to wrap that one up before I move on to another point?
I would say that the Netherlands, particularly, but also I think most of Scandinavia, if you go back to a historical anthropological view, a lot of anthropologists believe that there is a distinct North Sea culture which produced England, Scotland, but also the Netherlands and particularly Denmark. And these had a lot of characteristics. Well, for one reason, why was it a fertile bed for Calvinism when the rest of Germany was not? Many little things like that. And of course, the Netherlands had a big influence on the Anglosphere because, well, they gave us William of Orange, and a lot of Dutch institutions were replicated in England, like the Bank of England and the stock market. Those both, William brought them over from Amsterdam. They promptly eclipsed their Dutch originals. The Declaration of Independence was actually basically a copy of the Dutch, the Plakat, the Declaration of Independence from Spain, that John Adams, as a Calvinist, was quite familiar with. And he made many references to the Dutch Revolution against Spain in his writings. So this was, I'm not sure Dutch people realize how much influence they had on the United States.
Yeah, I'm also not sure how much knowledge there is among the broader public, but it is indeed under historians well known that these both Britain and the Netherlands and the United States and the Netherlands were from a very early stage deeply intertwined, and New Amsterdam becoming New York, and the merchant class in Amsterdam partially relocating themselves from Amsterdam to London after William III. Led the way. So, interestingly enough, the last big war between England and the Netherlands was won by the Netherlands, but it was arguably England that reaped the benefits economically, because now that it become one cultural zone, and under one king, you could relocate from Amsterdam to London and have a bigger market.
Well, it was an English Civil War as well.
There was also an English Civil War. I'm not saying that there was a big anti-Dutch conspiracy, but that's.
I've got to move us along here. This is a niche interest.
Hey.
But I want to move on. I'll come back to China at the end. But for the minute, I want to move on to a remark you made before, Jim, and I want you to explain it. And that is, you said we're moving into a new kind of world, one in which there will be small empires. And I think this relates to the talk you're going to be giving to us, and which will subsequently be available on the internet, on post-Ukraine. What will Europe be like as a result, and how will that affect relations between Europe and the Anglosphere?
Well, this comes out of the analysis that no matter what the outcome of the Ukraine war is, in either way, the world has already changed perceptions on account of it. And that perception is if the Ukraine had retained its nuclear weapons in 1995, the war would never have happened. There's just no way, even Putin, who's quite a risk taker, would have risked a nuclear incident happening. And the lesson from this is that if you've got an aggressive neighbor, the other thing is that the international system, the whole idea of international law and the alliances and security guarantees that were supposed to underlie it, and the power of sanctions and all this, failed. So the real conclusion is if you are a medium-sized country with an aggressive neighbor, the most rational thing to do is acquire nuclear weapons yourself. And there has already been a good deal of discussion over the last 10 to 20 years in defense establishments in various countries as to whether we can really trust the American guarantee. And I'm afraid Mr. Biden has not made anyone feel better about that, and the advent of Mr. Trump is even less. Whether those concerns are valid or not, this is the perception, and the perception is what is going to change policy. So you see, for instance, there's been a poll very recently in South Korea in which 80% of the population approved moving to a nuclear weapon status. Japan is beginning to revise its feeling. Inside the military establishment, there's actually no debate about it. But politically, of course, it is sensitive. But you have to remember that Hiroshima was 3 generations ago. And it's not going to be an eternal factor in Japanese politics. It's like, what happened 3 generations ago in our societies. People still think about it, but it doesn't make an ironclad rule anymore. In my talk, I've identified, I think, about 7 more nations that technologically could have nuclear weapons active within a year or 2. They're called one turn of the screwdriver states, i.e., they have all the necessary materials and technologies and a good technological base. Even countries that are not that far along are probably, almost any first world nation is no more than 5 years from attaining a nuclear capability. Netherlands could do it quite quickly.
Oh, we're back at the Netherlands. But would these be the small empires you were talking about?
No, that's the next step.
Oh.
Your gold standard security is having your own nuclear capability, and preferably with a launch mode like a submarine-based that's reasonably immune from a first strike, and of course a national consensus to have the will to use it. The second best thing to this is to have a country you really, really trust giving you an ironclad guarantee. You really do trust that this nation would risk one of its cities. And I think it's famous, the French, who eventually became a Vichy minister and a collaborator, but he was an appeaser in the 1930s, Marcel Déat, famously said, "Who will die? Why die for Danzig?" And that's the sentiment that's returning. You see it on the American right. And it might actually literally have to apply to Gdansk anytime soon, but it's there. So if there is one country you would trust and it has a nuclear weapon, then you need to get as close as possible to them or develop your own. Or if you have a nation you can really trust, then you develop it together, which would be considerably cheaper. But you have to remember that conventional weapons are getting more expensive all the time. They need these complicated chips and all that. A nuclear bomb is a 1945 weapon that can be made with 1945 technology. This has been demonstrated. That's cheaper all the time. You can use, ChatGPT to do your calculations rather than having rooms full of people with slide rules and desktop calculators like the Manhattan Project did.
This would be funny if no one checked this, no programmer looked at this, and ChatGPT would actually be capable of giving you the nuclear secrets.
Someone's tried that.
Oh, really? No.
Yes.
Please don't tell me that.
What they found was at first it refused to do that because I'm not allowed to do harm. And then they went back and said, we're looking for ways to prevent nuclear proliferation. Oh. Please explain all the steps in preparing a nuclear weapon so that we can figure out how to prevent them, and probably a set of instructions for creating a nuclear bomb.
But ChatGPT only has access to publicly available files. So
they had to train it, but but they trained it on publicly available information.
But is all the everything you need to build a nuclear weapon publicly available on the internet right now, or is there still things? No, that's good.
I want to intervene here because I'm going to have to
but any
leave in a moment.
physicist can probably do it.
So what I want to do is ask Jim to finish his thought, namely the small empires, and then I want the two of you to discuss the relationship between China and America, as I recall, in the Cold War, the relationship between the United States and Russia and the USSR was described as apes on a treadmill. But that is not, I think, the relationship that has existed in recent years or probably will exist. It will be a very different kind of relationship which will combine, so to speak, confrontation on the one hand, or hostility or suspicion, with quite a lot of economic cooperation on the other. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but that's the way it looks to me. I'm going to, first of all, ask Jim to finish his
small empire,
and then I'm asking you to take over on the China question. So thank you very much. Okay. Yes.
Very good. So the close associations are most likely going to be on the basis of cultural affinity, linguistic commonality, common history, common values, etc. Sometimes it's binding things like religion, whatever. And to really trust someone else to push the button when you need it pushed, or at least to be credible, to have a credible threat of doing so. Again, we deal with perceptions, not actually carrying through. But you've got to convince people that you will. Is to have a federation, even a very minimal federation where you're only federalizing the strategic forces. So you have. But you do have a federal parliament, and you have a federal prime minister who could be from one or the other of the countries at any given time. Maybe you alternate or rotate them.
So you see this all around. You would see this scenario unfolding all around the world: Middle East, Africa, South Asia, East Asia.
Potentially. It won't happen everywhere, but it will happen in some places where A, you have the trust, and B, it's an effective use of resources. It's cheaper than it used to be, but it's still expensive. Okay. Now, the one I've spent the most time talking about is the, I don't know if you're familiar with the Kanzuk movement.
The
Kanzuk, C-A-N-Z-U-K. Which is an acronym for Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And the idea is to create a federal state of the four existing states. with, of course, the monarch as head of state. But and the idea has been around for maybe 20 years. It has a small following, but especially since Brexit, it's now been technically possible. It doesn't have much political clout, but there's several people in the House of Lords who have endorsed the idea, etc.
But wait a second, aren't the Americans the natural leaders of the Anglosphere? Isn't the American economy and technological clout so heavy that it will automatically pull everything in the Anglosphere towards itself?
They're too preponderant. The problem is that if you put all four Kazakh nations together, there's still, I think, 135, 140 million people.
Yeah.
U.S. is, 330 the last time I've looked at it, and probably more by now. Depends on how many people who sneak across the border you count as population. Basically, the other four Kazakh nations wouldn't agree to a system where the U.S. could just outvote them all the time.
Okay.
And the U.S. wouldn't join a system where, a group with a third of the population could veto them or join them. So, besides, Britain's already got nuclear weapons, so you have your deterrent right there. All you have to do is trust them. And, what you would probably do in that case is you have a federal parliament, which is elected. You have a prime minister and a cabinet. You'd probably do not ethnic, but national origin balancing. And you would have the submarine service with nuclear weapons directly under the prime minister, and everything else remains the same. Maybe it gradually integrates economically over time, but it's purely a strategic thing. But the point is, it follows the footprint of the British Empire. I mean, Anglosphere stuff has been called Empire 2.0. But this really isn't a nostalgia exercise.
This is survival in the 21st century.
It's a strategic enterprise, and it goes on the fact that you can probably trust each other. But like Australians, they still have historic memories of Singapore and, also the Gallipoli and the perceived misuse of Australian troops under the British Imperial command. So they're not going to just trust the Brits by themselves, but they said, well, we might be in a system where we have a say, where we have a legally created say. So you double the number of British nuclear missile submarines that they're building, and you station some in the Pacific, and you have a global deterrent. It would be relatively easy. But some of the other possible ones in the world also follow historical examples. One, in regard to Central and Eastern Europe, you could look at Pilsudski's idea of the intermarium, of the federation of states running from Poland to Romania, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. That, if you could get everyone to agree on to it in the first place, they would certainly have the wealth to build a first-class gold standard deterrent system.
These are EU countries and mainly under NATO. So
this would be a subset of EU and NATO.
Subset of EU and NATO, but
because it would not technically a subset of EU, but they would all be EU countries.
But the EU countries, the EU is a very centralizing machine that doesn't necessarily. Is not necessarily fully on board with this networky, free-flowing, improvised, entrepreneurial, decentralizing vision that you have. They may say, "Hey, this is the European Commission may say, hey, this is our turf."
I think that the European Union is too broad. It has too much diversity of culture within it to ever centralize to the extent that the EU leadership is hoping for. And, all these, moving toward a federal Europe type movements never get anywhere because there's too much opposition. And especially, the Visegrad Four, the bloc of Eastern European states, it's been frayed by Hungary's position during the Ukraine war, but on the other hand, the Polish leadership is so strong. The other small empire configuration wouldn't be that large of a bloc, but it would be reviving the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which, if you recall, included most of what is now the Ukraine. So that you only have to have 3 states agree on, and that's much easier to do.
So you see a lot of...
And at some point, some of these states are going to have to say, either you let us do this within a loosened pan-European framework, or we're just going to Brexit and we're just going to do it. And with that, with that kind of pressure, it might work.
Yeah, exactly. For that kind of pressure, because that's what the whole scenario is based on. That now some of these subgroupings seem unrealistic. But if nuclear weapons start raining in any war in the 21st century and people become terrified, all of a sudden there's a lot of political will to seek partners and to create formations in which you actually have trust that someone would take a serious risk for you to keep your people safe. Precisely. Okay, this makes perfect sense. And let's follow, because I got King John has given me instructions that we have to talk about America, China, and let's transition there, because the Anglosphere, as we've been talking about the Anglosphere, it has a civilizational coherence.
Yes.
There may be little empires emerging within this network Anglosphere, but then there's another unit that's on the horizon and that we've not touched upon. It's the Sinosphere. It's the Chinese world, which the Chinese are trying to build, but many parts of what historically was the Sinosphere are now flourishing nation states or trade centers such as Singapore. Right. So I've lived in China for 6 years, and I've noticed that if I talk to my Chinese acquaintances and friends about international politics, there is often a kind of there is a sense of exceptionalism, and it's tempting when you look at such a large culture zone such as China from such a large bloc. If you're looking into the world, it's tempting to think that your surrounding countries are sort of things you own. So, like, you often have a sense of, for instance, that if you in Beijing, if people talk about Koreans, they will often say, "Oh, yeah, this is a kind of derivative culture from our culture, right?" But Koreans will definitely not be on board with that reading, especially not given their recent accomplishments in popular culture and technology. The Singaporeans are also not on board with being a colony, but I've heard Chinese describe them casually as, kind of part of China. And I would be like, in what sense is it kind of part of China? They're like, well, it's kind of, connected and it's kind of China, right? I'm like, in what sense is it kind of China? It's like you get to call the shots there. Is the Communist Party directly in charge? No, but... And there's this lingering sense of a Sinosphere, and there's a longing to actually build it. But that's going to run into the American empire and the Anglosphere interests very, very quickly.
Or even, reviving the Japanese empire in a more genteel fashion.
Yeah, you also have the Japan problem. But even if you ignore Japan... we have the Taiwan scenario where, of course, this is direct. There's going to be a very likely direct clash. There's already a lot of pressure on that, and it's likely to increase further.
Well, Taiwan is also high on the list of one turn of the screwdriver states.
Yes.
And with the demonstration of naval drone warfare that's happened in the Black Sea, I think that once the PLA Navy has really reviewed that and absorbed that, they might start telling the Politburo to go slow on the Taiwan thing, because, that's what, 90 miles of water that they have to cross. And it's not hard to build a drone or a missile that has a range for that. And if there was a hint that they might be nuclear armed, then... a Taiwanese invasion of Taiwan, a direct invasion, would be a bloodbath for the Chinese. So that may be backing off a little bit. But because there's an alternate configuration, which is basically Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the old core of the old Japanese empire. But and those are what I'm saying. I don't expect to see all the imperial forms be revised, but I do say these are geographical patterns that made sense at some time and could make sense again.
Could make sense again. And then if we look at the likely blocks, so we have the Anglosphere. The West is bifurcated, so you have such a thing as the Western world, but within the Western world, the Anglosphere takes prominence as it's already doing. Then probably the other most important player will be China, and then after that will follow other formations. Yes. So you're going to have a world where the two leading blocks, the two leading empires, so those would be the great empires, not the small empires, would be the Anglosphere and China. Would you agree with that portrayal?
Yeah, the Anglosphere, because there will still be a pan-European entity of some sort. Yeah. It might call itself the EU, or the EU proper might shrink to its Charlemagnean core.
Well,
and, although I suspect the Netherlands would not be up for that.
No, but I'm also thinking that a lot of these Eastern European societies are depopulating, and actually need to close ties with the EU. So I think also because of the way the population has moved on the European continent, it's likely that the EU will not lose members. If the population was shifting eastward, maybe things could be different. But the population is still shifting westward, very rapidly. So I expect the EU to survive. But this is also a cultural thing. If you're in the Anglosphere, you spend and you read, for instance, British newspapers. The fall of the EU is always very near. Sometimes you see headlines in British press saying the EU could fall next week, or the EU could fall within a few months. And actually, from the continent where I'm located, this makes absolutely no sense. And I've never believed a single headline. And we don't even discuss these headlines being published in Britain because they seem so absurd to us. Because our entire system is increasingly carried by Brussels, focused on Brussels. So I think the question is just how much are we going to centralize within Europe, federalize, that is, and how much can we push? Can we provide some resistance from the regions and from the different nations, not to decentralize too much? And I think that the whole fight is between those two poles on a wider spectrum, and it actually the EU. The EU seems pretty solidly established, but I mean that's a cultural difference again, because that's how it looks at it from the inside. I know that from the Anglosphere, the EU is something that could disappear.
Well, I don't generally take the Daily Mail as the expert on European affairs, but
the Economist will write about this as well.
But what about the migration issue? Unless Brussels turns against the easy, open immigration, that is driving a lot of sentiment against the EU in countries that used to never have it.
Yeah, so every time that there's been real pressures in 2015, after 2015, and currently, what you see is that the elites in Brussels immediately become more tough on migration, at least rhetorically, but they're also moving in a policy direction. So in the last few months, Ursula von der Leyen has been going around trying to at least appear as if she's working on curbing illegal mass migration. But I think this is how it works. As soon as there's a strong political incentive, people start running. I mean, a lot of these supposedly mass migration friendly elites, also on the national level, are not really what they seem. Right, so the mass migration situation in Europe is very complex. Let's take the German government. The German government under Merkel had Willkommenskultur as the slogan, right? So they were perceived, especially abroad, as being very friendly towards migration. Mm-hmm. But secretly, the Germans were not so secretly, were funding countries all up to Central Africa to stop migrant flows. So there was no one more adamant about stopping migrant flows than the Germans. What did the Germans need? The Germans needed the Hungarians to build a large fence. The Hungarians built a large fence. For Hungary, no, those migrants were going to Germany and to Sweden and to the Netherlands. So they were building it for the Germans, but public intellectuals like to say, oh, who are those close-minded, foreigner-hating Hungarians and Poles doing illegal pushbacks there on the border. Was in fact, they were doing it for Germany, right? Then you have a country like Hungary. Hungary has supposedly a very anti-mass migration position. It welcomes migration, some migration, but these are just guests, not mass migration, certainly not mass migration from the Islamic world. Guess what? There's been a lot of influx of workers here in industry from Indonesia. They're bringing in Indonesian guest workers. Now, well, who are these people? Well, they're probably Muslim, right? So the country that no one is really what they seem. So you have the rhetoric of mass migration. The actual situation is very complex. The actual situation is that we have a lot of economies in Europe that need migrants, but they need, skilled migrants, or at least disciplined migrants that are going to be contributing instead of being unemployed. And so they're also against illegal migration. They don't want illegal migration because then you don't have control over who gets into your country. So secretly, a lot of people who pretend to be pro-mass migration out of the kindness of their hearts are secretly anti-uncontrolled mass migration and are very serious about that. And a lot of people who claim not to want migration from the Muslim world actually are open to workers wherever they can find them if they have a sense that these workers will be contributing to the economy. So it's all very complex, and the political situation, the political rhetoric doesn't really meet the realities on the ground, so to speak. But I'm speaking way too. I'm ranting now about the European situation. We're supposed to talk about China versus the US.
Well, China fits into the small empires model, except that it's kind of a large empire. But I think that China may see the value of going to a somewhat more decentralized internal structure, because I think that Xi's current turn toward a more authoritarian model for China is not going to work economically or culturally or whatever. Now, he can't be voted out of office because they don't have a democratic system, but he and his approach may be seen as, losing the mandate of heaven, which of course still exists without the title. But I don't see China's borders changing, the external borders.
Okay.
I mean, there's a question of whether, from my point of view, I think, well, if they had offered a really sincere autonomy offer to Taiwan 10, 15 years ago, and if they had stuck to a real autonomy model for Hong Kong, the fact that they didn't really turned public opinion in Taipei, I don't think we can do a deal. In 1995, you had a lot of Taiwanese who say, let's watch what happens to Hong Kong, and maybe we could set up some kind of deal that would get us off the hot seat, but that's gone. And of course now some of the, frankly, predatory economic activity they've had with the United States and with the West is also losing its, aura of success. We are going to see a lot of trade with China shut down. There was a wave of thought that went through American corporate management in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Let's replace all our expensive American subcontractors with cheap Chinese subcontractors. And that's not worked out well, both from the supply chain security point of view and from the quality of the work has been, they start out pretty decent quality and then they gradually downgrade it over time because they figure the customer is stuck with us. And there's a lot of sentiment, not just, the security-oriented, but although that's becoming a lot more important now too, there's a lot of sentiment for reshoring stuff to America. And since American energy is relatively cheap, you're also getting European companies moving work to the United States because the energy in the U.S. is now so much cheaper than European, and will continue to be so. So China needs to adjust its internal economics. It needs to, I think, do a rethink on its foreign policy. They can't be quite as aggressive to small nations on the periphery because of the small empire business. I mean, I could see a number of the countries on China's periphery going for nuclear capability primarily to not be bossed around. They would still have a strong economic relationship with China because it just makes sense. They would, they're not going to close their borders to China anytime, and they will have to remain on a reasonably friendly basis. But they, if they affiliate with other powers, then they don't have satellite status with China. I mean, you had this old, the imperial China had this tributary status with the countries on its periphery. And in a way, they didn't really recognize any other country in the world as being
interestingly enough, they didn't see themselves as a country either, because they were the central area and not a country.
All under heaven.
Yeah.
But, the last 2 centuries have just been Chinese searching for a model that allows them to be Chinese and exist in the world with all these other nations, which for a long time have been stronger than them, which is they're still having a hard time with that one.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of nostalgic idea of going back to the natural state of things in which China was number one and everybody else was tributary of some sort.
Well, I think this is a good note to end on. So we've gone through we traveled through the world map, or at least covered a fair bit of it. Mr. Bennett, thanks for your contributions, and again, welcome to the Danube Institute. And we'll be having an event on this week with you as well, and it's great. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, and I look forward to the event on Friday.